performance was in the HBO series Big Love
Yes.
in 2006 and 7. So I think you'll agree this is a fine film that holds up very well over time. Let me talk about Michael Curtiz first and what happened to everybody. Curtiz began to get cancer on this film. And by the time he made his last film, 1961, he was making The Comancheros with John Wayne in Moab.
Right.
His last film. He was so sick with cancer in Moab while directing that film that Wayne actually had to take over direction in the middle of the film and go away to the end. The film was released. Curtiz died just a few months after that in 1961. So he ended his spectacular career in Utah, one of the most beautiful places in Utah. Olivia de Havilland, still going strong at 104 in Paris, France. And I had the chance to interview her in 1977 in Hollywood. And I had Nelson Wadsworth, our Utah Westerner, with me. He took photographs during the interview. It was a special section of BYU's Daily Universe way back in 1977. And one of the highlights of my experience is interviewing Olivia de Havilland in person for an hour and a half. One of my first publications in a magazine was my interview with her. She loved working with motion pictures, but didn't like being directed by Michael Curtiz because of his incredible reputation for being really a bore with actors. He treated them like cattle. However, on this film, maybe with age, maybe with experience, maybe with illness, he had mellowed enough to where she said this was a delightful experience. And even young David Ladd said, I'd heard all the rumors about Michael Curtiz, but he was patient, he was kind, he very gently directed me in my performance. So it was a good experience all the way around. Now, when I interviewed Miss de Havilland, even at 27, I was smart enough to take my copy of her autobiography published in 1961 called Every Frenchman Has One. Now, it wasn't a very good book. She didn't tell a lot of secrets in the making of the movies, but I took my copy along, and after our wonderful interview, I had her inscribe it to me, and hopefully you can see her incredible signature. It's very flowing, it's gorgeous, it's elegant. I hope you can see it there. And that was in October of 1977. And I said, would you add one thing? Would you mind writing your favorite line of dialogue from your favorite role in the movies? Now, I'm going to hesitate a minute, and you try and guess. Of all the roles from Maid Marian in The Adventures of Robin Hood, it was Melanie in Gone with the Wind. It was a part she campaigned for. She was wonderful. And so she inscribed this following line of dialogue that Melanie, the dying Melanie in Gone with the Wind, says to a weeping Scarlett O'Hara, "Be kind to Captain Butler. He loves you so." Boy, what a great exit line before you die. That was a marvelous experience with Olivia de Havilland. I also had the chance to be with on the stage and to interview David Ladd in 2014 when I interviewed him for two different screenings, one at SUU and the other one in the film series that I sponsored at BYU that same year. He candidly told me, he said, even as an 11-year-old, I had a crush on Olivia de Havilland. well, did you do anything with her? He said, oh, we went fishing together. I caught lots of fish. She loved to fish. And I just thought she was a wonderful woman. And David Ladd is still alive. He went from a number of films in front of the camera as an actor to behind the camera as a producer at Columbia Pictures and then at MGM. He still does independent film deals even now, today. A great, great guy, wonderful guy.
How old is he, Jim?
Young age didn't spoil him. Now, Alan Ladd. He only lived until January of 1964. On January 29th, people found him dead in his bed. He was an insomniac throughout much of his later life. He took sleeping pills, and the coroner said that death came from alcohol and 3 other drugs. It ruled a suicide, but an overdose. And his very last film, The Carpetbaggers, from the Harold Robbins novel, was released just a few months after his death, and it was a very big success. Dean Jagger, who played the mean ogre, Harry Burley, and who played the title role in Brigham Young, 17 years before The Proud Rebel, joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1991. I invited him to BYU for a celebration of his films, and he died just a few years after that. So you've got a quality cast in a very good film, and I thought it was a good one to show the Utah Westerners. Even though the film was set in Illinois, it was filmed in the good old Beehive State. So thanks for enjoying the movie.
Great job. Have you have any
Thanks, Jim.
questions?
That was great.
Any
How
questions?
old is, yeah, I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
How old is David Ladd?
Was he then?
Well, then and now?
He was born in 1947.
Oh, okay.
So what is he, 73 maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sounds,
Yeah.
that sounds right.
in good health, a nice guy.
Jim,
Yes.
John Taylor here.
Mhm.
You've forgotten one thing. The best actor in the movie was the dog.
Ah, and the dog's name was King. Isn't he great?
There's a credit for him.
There is.
Yeah,
That's right.
I was wondering who King was.
King was
Hey, Jim.
Lance the dog in the movie. Yeah.
Jim, I wanted to ask about the structures, the old houses that you saw. Were those Cedar City area houses or
Very good question.
them?
The houses in the town was a old Western town built in 1951 for the MGM film Westward the Women in Johnson Canyon, east of Kanab. That's where they were. The farmhouse of Lynette Moore and Harry Burley were in the Rush Lake area, just northwest of Cedar City. And I've been told by people down there that Lynette Moore's house was an operating farm at the time, and the house was torn down in the mid to late 1960s. So it no longer exists.
Do any of those structures still exist today?
I don't know about the Harry Burley Ranch. No one could tell me where that one was, but the town of Aberdeen, which was in Johnson Canyon, east of Kanab, is on private property now. The owners made no effort to preserve those buildings. There's a huge chain link fence around the property, and the buildings are nearly gone, just from weathering and collapsing. Yeah.
Where were the interiors? Sorry, where were the interiors shot?
The interiors were shot at the Goldwyn Studios in Hollywood. Yeah. So September to early October of 1957, they filmed on location in Cedar City, Cedar Mountain, and in Kane County. Then they did the interiors last in Hollywood. Then it was released in May of 1958.
Jim Spence here. Notice on the opening credits, Don Cash was one of the makeup people. Was he one of the Utah makeup artists?
I don't know. Don't know much about Don Cash. He was a very popular makeup artist, particularly for Western
Yeah.
stuff. But I'm sorry to say I don't know anything more about him.
Right. We did have some well-known Utahns that worked in the film industry in makeup over the years.
The Westmore family.
Westmore's, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yep. Perce Westmore and I believe his 2 or 3 brothers were probably the most prominent makeup artists in Hollywood and worked with Max Factor to develop makeup specifically for certain types of black and white film and then Technicolor, because they required very different kinds of hues, because it depended not on how it looked to the naked eye, it's how it looked, how it was exposed on film.
Yeah.
Westmore's were terrific.
That's who I'm thinking of.
If you could check on imdb.com.
Say again?
Oh, you could look up Don Cash on imdb.com.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, any comments about the film itself? Anything you noticed?
Yeah, why don't they make films like that today? I mean, we don't see anything
Because
like done today.
because we are in today, not in 1957 and 58.
Not me.
Well, you know, part of how I taught film and history at BYU was relating these specific films, whether it was Birth of a Nation or Dr. Strangelove, to the time periods in which they were made. Because in spite of the time period, whether the West or ancient Greece, there are things in those movies that reveal the time period in which it was made, not just the time period they're trying to portray. So a different culture will produce a very different kind of film from the kind of films we have today.
When was Shane
Answer to your question, one of the reasons they don't make them like that today is the culture wouldn't be entertained like that today. It's not edited fast enough. There's not enough violence, or the degree of violence isn't there. Yeah, that's why I'm glad these great films are preserved, because they can be enjoyed in their own element, from their own time period.
James, what year was Gone with the Wind made? Was that 38?
1939.
39. It seems to me like the entire setup of Gone with the Wind that was 17 years earlier? Is my math right? Anyway, 17, 18 years earlier.
Oh, you mean earlier than The Proud Rebel?
Yes, thank
Oh,
you.
yeah.
Yeah, it just seems to me like it seemed a lot more polished than the Rebel movie that we just watched. And they had that much time to get that much better at making movies. I'm just curious as to whether that's stylistic that it came across that way, or was Gone with the Wind really that superb of a film?
Oh, Gone with the Wind was that superb of a film. In fact,
Okay.
just for inflation, it's probably been seen by more people around the world than any film released before or since.
Wow.
It's one of the true blockbusters of all time. using state-of-the-art techniques, state-of-the-art Technicolor, costumes, set design, everything. Yeah, it's deservedly one of the great monuments of Hollywood filmmaking. Although you have to set aside an afternoon to watch it. It's
Right.
so long.
Well, I saw it several years ago, and watching her in that movie and the movie tonight, you can still see a lot of her facial similarities. You know, she's
Oh,
still,
yes.
still. I thought she was still a very attractive lady at the old age of 42 or whatever.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, you remind me about something about her style. And I promised to tell you the story of when she could get really flinty and demanding, where that came from in her. And it has to do with a court case that she initiated in 1943, where she, as a contract player at Warner Brothers, sued the studio. So what did she sue them for? Well, in California contract law, if you were signed to a contract at a studio, they were usually for 7 years. However, if a player was assigned to do a movie and refused to do the part, they were put on suspension, usually for 6 months. Some actors, like James Cagney and Bette Davis, who felt they were thrown bad parts, that were forced on them by Jack Warner, they were on suspension for a long time. And under California law, the studios could add the time under suspension to the 7-year contract.
Oh, boy.
To where Bette Davis and James Cagney probably had 3 years added onto a 7-year contract.
Wow.
Bette Davis sued in the late 1930s. Now, you would think the toughest of those two women would be whom? Bette Davis.
Yeah.
And she was. Those are the kind of parts she got in movies. Cold, icy, determined. She always got her way. Olivia de Havilland slugged it out in court for 8 months. And when she got a decree in November of 1943, she won. And that practice of adding suspension time to contracts was forever ended. And to this day, it's known in legal circles in Hollywood as the de Havilland law.
Wow.
Now, when you win a court case like that, what do you think your chances of getting work in Hollywood are? She didn't make a film for another 3 years. But when she did, she got an Academy Award for it in 1946 for a film To Each His Own. And then she went to an Oscar-nominated role as a woman trying to cope with an insane asylum in the 1948 movie, The Snake Pit, which was a really good movie with John Garfield. And she had a stellar career, both on film and in television. So Olivia Havilland was a very determined lady, and that grit came out in her performance in tonight's film.
Yeah.
Jim,
Great woman.
She has shown that grit more recently, just a 3 years ago, when she filed yet another lawsuit because of a misrepresentation involving how she was mischaracterized. Tell us about that. I think it involved Bette Davis as well.
You're exactly right. It was I can't remember the cable channel that produced this original movie. It may have been Showtime. I can't remember. I don't think it was a network film, but it was about Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, I believe. And Olivia de Havilland's depiction was involved in it. And she
was furious.
raised the roof and sued. Now, she lost, but she fought a vigorous fight. And that's the same Olivia de Havilland from the 1930s, 40s, and beyond. Isn't it wonderful to see people like that who can still get enough moxie and grit to fight for what they think is right? So I got to hand it to that old gal. She's terrific.
Jim, I came on maybe a few minutes late, but did you report on your interview with her?
I did, just briefly. You know, we didn't talk about this film specifically. We talked about her career with being in 8 films with Errol Flynn, being one of the top actresses in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Even the fact that even though she didn't like being Errol Flynn's girlfriend in these films because the roles weren't very well developed, she actually fell in love with Flynn
Oh,
and almost consented to marry him. He proposed to her,
wow.
but she knew about his wild lifestyle, and as charismatic and magnetic as he was as a personality, she thought, I'd better not do it. And given the way that Errol Flynn ended up, that was probably the best choice.
Oh,
Smart woman. She wasn't a survivor for nothing.
Jim, can I ask a question about the? It appeared that it was authentic. Did they have to learn that, and was that good for that period of time?
You cut out when you asked what your question was about.
The American Sign Language in the film.
Oh, yeah, the signing. Yes, young David went to an institute where they worked with mutes, and he embedded there for weeks to learn how to sign, to learn what their facial expressions were, even their vocal efforts to try and speak. Yeah, he trained for weeks.
he did a fabulous job.
Wasn't it a great performance from an 11-year-old?
Absolutely.
And that look in his face is so authentic. Not a false note about him. Now, during this screening, I mean, I've seen this film many times. Do you remember the 3 boys that bully him
Yeah.
when they go into town? The one in the middle, I would swear, is Kurt Russell
Oh,
as a little boy. He
yeah.
looks just like what Russell looked like as a little boy. And so I searched his filmography on the web. It isn't listed, but I'm going to do more research on that because I'm sure that is he. As a
I think you
young
may be
man.
right.
That's even before Kurt Russell started acting at the Walt Disney Studios. So I got to check this out some more.
Yeah.
Some of these things you don't see until the right time and the right place. And apparently this was. I'd never noticed that before.
Jim, tell us briefly about the filmatic technique back then. We didn't have green screens and character generators and all of the manufacturing of images that we have today. The fire must have been a real fire, a real barn that burned.
It was a real farm, a barn. They built it a few weeks before production began, made it look rough-hewn. But there are certain shots where the lighting is so good on the characters that the background looks like a still photograph. And that's called rear projection photography if there's action going on in the background. Or it's called a process shot, where they call it a plate. They take a still photograph, put it up on a screen behind the performer in the studio, and shoot them against. There were maybe a dozen of those shots in this film. And those are usually done after they've done a preliminary edit. And they say, no, that scene's too long. We have to do a cutaway to either Olivia de Havilland or Alan Ladd or to David Ladd. So that's usually an after the fact, just for dramatic purposes. And so they'll go in and they'll shoot that kind of a shot and add it in for whatever reason. Good question.
Well, that big part of the barn that fell in toward him and stopped, that looked to me like it had to be a shot like that.
That was a real shot.
Was it really?
No,
Wow.
yeah, that was on location, and you only do that once.
Yeah, right.
I think they use those shots when they want to show more facial expression and good lighting on the face. But I think
Yes.
could have tried with more reflection of light. Maybe they could have accomplished it even back then in the time period.
Oh,
that
they could have. You could have reflectors showing up on the face, particularly where they were backlit by the sunset. You know, when he was plowing and afterwards. But, you know, it all depends. Maybe they tried to, and once the film was processed, it was too bright or it didn't turn out well enough. So they settled for what they shot. Now, I'm only speculating there. But when you're filming on location, those kind of things can happen, where you think you've got it.
Yeah.
You get the rushes back from Hollywood after they're printed, and you're projecting them, which they probably would have done at a theater in downtown Cedar City once they got the film back, the day's film from processing in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And you can't go back and shoot it again because you can't match the shots.
This was the era of when widescreen was coming on, Super Scope and some of the others, but this was not apparently widescreen film.
No, it wasn't. It was shot what's called full frame, and they allowed for the top and the bottom to be cropped. Because the ratio of this film is such that if you shoot it in a square frame, when you cut off the tops and the bottoms, it makes it wider into what we know today is a 6:9 format.
Yeah.
So Ted McCord, the cinematographer, would have markings on his viewfinder to show where the safe areas were, so that they were within that aspect ratio. Okay.
Yeah.
So he would see that through the viewfinder.
I wonder, Spence, you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit about your experience with Olivia.
Oh, it's nothing much, nothing like what Professor Dark has done. I met her the year after he did, in 1978, in Owensboro, Kentucky, in an event called the American Academy of Achievement, in which she was being honored. That was the first time I met her. She came back to 2 other events later on, much in her later years, the last one in Scottsdale, and her daughter, Giselle, who lived at that time in Santa Fe and was a writer for Paris Match magazine, was there with us. And at that time, she was asked to do some things, and she asked me to help her. Now, that was a humbling moment, to be asked by Olivia de Havilland and to prompt her through what we needed to get through. And she was just the most delightful lady, very kind and very generous, and many of the same mannerisms that you see on film, she was that way in person. Just delightful and so gracious and thankful for the help.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, every inch a lady.
Yes, indeed.
Well,
Did we exhaust everybody?
any more
I have
questions?
one question.
Yeah.
I noticed on the landscape there towards some of the wide fields that there were these different form of trees that made me believe that it was somewhere else. It was kind of like low. I don't know if you noticed that. I mean, we saw Quakey, we saw, pine trees, but then we saw these very strange type shaped trees, and I didn't know, was that shot somewhere else or if that was actually right on the landscape where everything else was?
No, and I think I know the part that you were looking at, which was such a dramatic difference from the barren prairie.
Yeah.
Was, and it's when David runs across the creek with the dog, and they are on a bridge. Alan Ladd and Olivia de Havilland are on a bridge. That's up on Cedar Mountain. That's far away from the ranch location where the ranch scenes were filmed. So that was a severe jump cut into countryside that is nowhere near where that ranch was supposed to be. Yeah, and that was a pretty obvious one. You spotted it.
The other scene I noticed was in the opening scene as he and the boy are coming down the road. That seemed like an awfully developed road for the time period. It was because it was well developed when they filmed it. But they thought it's brief enough that Easterners might not know the difference.
Well, there's that one moment where you see Red Rock Mountain in the background too. I mean, that's
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. But you know, going to the movies, as analysts say, is the willing suspension of disbelief.
Sure.
And in a movie like that, you're paying attention to the stars.
Yep.
And you're only seeing it once. And the movie makers figure that'll go by quickly.
Yep.
And the other thing they say is if they're looking there, we lost them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Yep.
Well, this has been great, Jim. Great job. A good movie, great movie. Thanks everybody for showing up. I think this was I think technologically we pulled this off, and that's the best thing we could have done. So
Thanks to all your expertise. Thanks to all of you for.
that would be Steve Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve, for
A vote of
setting
thanks
this up.
to all of us.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I look forward to next July.
Yeah,
Thank
we'll
you.
figure out something fun and